Well, good evening. Welcome to Wednesday Night Adult Bible Study. I'm so happy that you are joining us and you're going to study the scriptures with us as we continue our look at the Sermon on the Mount. Today, we shift into Matthew chapter 6. We finished Matthew chapter 5 last week, and we shift into the next portion of Jesus' sermon here, and we're going to see some really interesting things. It reminded me, as I thought of this passage, of a story I heard about Alexander the Great. One day, he was traveling along the road, and there was a beggar, and of course, a beggar speaking out to the emperor would be absurd, but this beggar was in so much need, such desperate need, that he called out to the emperor and said, "Please look down on me with mercy. Would you give me some money?" And the emperor looked down and threw down a few gold coins. And the emperor's servant looked at him and said, "Master, that's ridiculous. The beggar only needed some copper coins. Surely that would have been enough." And Alexander the Great replied with this comment: "Copper coins would suit the beggar's needs, but gold coins suit Alexander's giving." See, what he was saying is that might have been enough, but I am the type of person who is going to be more generous. And what we're going to see today is Jesus is going to speak broadly about what's to come over the next three portions of our study, but also specifically about generosity and giving and how God's people, that is, citizens of God's kingdom, how we should be generous. Today we're going to see that because Jesus is going to continue to talk about motives. Now in chapter 5, he talked about how our sins are motivated by our heart, right? The fact that murder is motivated by anger, the fact that adultery is motivated by lust, and how it all starts in the heart. That's what we saw last week. Well, today what we want to begin to see as we look at chapter 6 is that good deeds have to come from the heart as well. So what we'll see over the next few weeks is that these good things come from the heart. The Bible constantly and consistently focuses on our hearts. The Proverbs 21:2 says, "All a person's ways seem right to him, but the Lord weighs the heart." Proverbs 4:23 says, "Guard your heart above all else, for it is the source of life, because out of our heart our life flows." Jesus repeatedly focused on the heart as well. Luke chapter 6, verse 45, it says, "A good person produces good out of the good stored up in his heart. An evil person produces evil out of the evil stored up in his heart, for his mouth speaks from the overflow of the heart." You've heard me say it before. The old preacher used to say, "What's in the well comes up in the bucket." And so it's important that we recognize what's in our heart, because that's what comes out of us in word and in deed. And so we need to make sure that our heart is motivated the right way, is focused the right way, and that is what Jesus is telling us here. So let's jump in Matthew chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. Look what it says. "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father in heaven." So Jesus here is setting up what we're going to see over the next 18 verses, that we have to not practice righteousness to be seen by others. Because if we do, that's about pride, that's about arrogance, that's about wanting to lift ourselves up. And if we do that, then that's what we'll get, but that means there'll be no reward for us in heaven, because we're not pointing people to God. We're simply doing things so that we are seen. He's telling us that the audience for our righteous actions should be God and not people. First, today we'll talk about in giving. Next week we'll talk about in fasting. The week after we'll talk about, next week we'll talk about in prayer, and then the week after we'll talk about in fasting. He says we should not be doing these things, and then he uses this word. He says it's translated to be seen by them. It's the word theaomai, and it's rooted in the same Greek word that we get the word theater from. It's rooted in that same place, this idea of performing or portraying something that you're really not. It's interesting because in a little bit, he's going to use the word hypocrites, which is based off of the Greek word for the word actor. And so it's interesting that he's talking about the fact that if we're playing righteousness, if we're performing righteousness to be seen by an audience of people, we're actually just acting. We're not doing the right thing, and our motives are wrong. So I ask you this question as you think about the giving that you do. When you're generous to people, who are you trying to impress? When you're being generous to someone, you're leaving a big tip or you're giving a gift, who are you trying to impress? Because who you are trying to impress is who will give you the reward. If you're trying to impress a girl because you're out on a date and you leave this massive tip, well, if your goal is to impress the girl, then you might impress the girl, but you're not going to impress God. Because you weren't being generous to be generous, you were being generous to receive affection from this person. Who you are trying to receive applause from is where your reward will come from. Galatians chapter 1, verse 10, Paul's here saying that we need to focus on our God who is our audience, that what we do is not for men, but for God. Listen to what it says, for am I now trying to persuade people or God? Or am I striving to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. In other words, if we are God's people, if we are citizens of God's kingdom, then we are not interested in pleasing and serving people. Everything we are doing is about serving God. Now, that does mean we serve people as an outflow of our service to the Lord. Let's continue looking, verse 2 through 4 of Matthew chapter 6. So whenever you give to the poor, don't sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues. Remember that word hypocrites, actors, do in the synagogues and on the streets to be applauded by people. Truly, I tell you, they have their reward. But when you give to the poor, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father, God, who sees in secret, will reward you. I want to notice two specific truths in this passage. One is very obvious, it's the main point, but another one is less obvious, and it's kind of implied, and we need to point that out right here at the beginning, and that is this. There is an expectation of generosity. Jesus here, preaching to people who would become his disciples, who would follow him, he was saying that there is an expectation of generosity. What did he say in verse 2? Whenever you give to the poor. Not if you give to the poor, not should you give to the poor, but when you give to the poor. It's expected. It's expected that that's going to happen. Think about it. When you were a teenager and your parents would say, when are you going to be home? Well, that was based on the expectation that you were coming home. So the question was when, right? In this case, Jesus is saying when you give to the poor. It's an expectation that we will be generous to people. And it's tucked away, but it's right there, plain and simple. If we think about it, it is presupposed that a righteous person will be a generous person. I've heard it said this way: God's people are generous people. So are you being generous in your life? I mean, this makes sense when we think about it, right? God's people should be open-handed. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 2, Paul writing here talks about a church that is being very generous even though they don't have much to give. He says this about the Macedonians: during a severe trial brought about by affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. He said, even though they were going through trials and they were afflicted and they were poor, they came together and they were incredibly generous to us so that we could take the gospel to other people. God's people should be open-handed because we recognize none of this is ours anyway. Everything we have was given to us by God. Every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights. And so we should then be open-handed to give it to other people. God's people not only should be open-handed, but we should be eternally focused. In Matthew chapter 6, in one of the most famous passages, we're going to see this in a little bit later in a few weeks, Jesus says this during the Sermon on the Mount: don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys, where thieves don't break in. In other words, we shouldn't be focused on this world in the sense of trying to gather and gain and hoard. Instead, we should not be worried about this. Instead, we're focused on our reward in heaven. And so we're willing to give away these things so that we can be focused on eternity. We should be eternally focused. We should be open-handed. And God's people should also seek to help those in need. We should be compassionate towards the needy. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 21 says, the one who despises his neighbor sins, but whoever shows kindness to the poor will be happy. See, when we give to the poor, when we come to people who are in need, that generosity that is expected of God's people reflects back to God, and it is an encouragement to those who are in need. As messengers of God's grace, we recognize that grace meets needs. That's why we have that as one of our core values. Listen, the truth is this: God was so generous with us. So it only makes sense that we, as His people, as citizens of His kingdom, that we would be generous with others. The second truth here is very clear. Personal promotion is the wrong reason for giving. Personal promotion is the wrong reason for giving. Jesus here is saying we need to give, we need to be generous, it's expected, but we have to do it for the right reason, and personal promotion is not the right reason. What did He say in verse 1? He said, don't do these things to be seen. In verse 2, He said, don't do these things to be applauded by men. If your goal is to be seen and celebrated being generous, then that will also be your reward. And there are plenty of people across the world who give and do things because they want to be promoted themselves. They want to show a higher stature. They want to have people look at them in a certain way. And that's what their reward will be. But as citizens of God's kingdom, our reward will lie in heaven if we give the way Jesus has told us to. As believers, our goal is not to promote ourselves, but our Savior. In John chapter 3, verse 30, John the Baptist, talking about his ministry, said this: Jesus, He must increase and I must decrease. In other words, we need to make sure that Jesus is front and center. We need to make sure that His ministry, what He did, is more important than who I am and what I have done. Instead, Jesus tells us to be private with our giving, which will lead to an eternal reward. Don't be focused on self-promotion through your giving, but be private. Now, to be clear, when He says don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing, Jesus isn't saying that you can't give in public. Right? Because remember, back at the beginning of this, He says, when you give to the poor, don't sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues. In other words, sometimes you give in the synagogues to people who are in need. The point is, don't make a big deal about it. It's okay to give in public. Just don't make a big deal about your giving. Why? Because it's not about us. It's about Jesus. And He's also not saying, by the way, when He says, don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing when you're giving. He's also not saying to keep things from yourself or from other people who are close to you. In other words, a man can't say, well, I gave $1,000 to this person in need, but I'm not telling my wife because I don't want my right hand to know what my left hand is doing. No, your wife needs to know if you're giving money away, because that affects her and your household and your family, and the two of you are one. And so that's not an excuse to hide things. Instead, what Jesus is saying is give privately. Give privately, where God is the one who receives the glory and he gives you the reward. Mark chapter 9, verse 41, Jesus said, whoever gives you a cup of water to drink in my name because you belong to Christ, truly I tell you, he will never lose his reward. See, when we're generous in the right way, we are gathering for ourselves rewards in heaven. We are eternally focused and we are doing good, but for the right reasons. I want to give you 3 right or righteous reasons you can be generous. 3 righteous reasons to be generous. First, real compassion. Not compassion like you want to look good in front of people. Oh, I'm so sad for this person. Let me give him a $20 bill, but I'm going to wait until everybody sees me put it in his hand. No, but real compassion. You look and you see need and you say, I want to help. Jesus described fake compassion focused on self-promotion in this passage when He talked about these hypocrites, these people who would give and they would do it in such a way to be loud and boisterous so that people would applaud them. Real compassion comes from the love of God that is inside of our hearts. We are compassionate because God was compassionate to us even when we didn't deserve it. 1 John chapter 3, verses 16 through 18, it says this: this is how we have come to know love. He laid down His life for us, so we should also lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. Listen to this, verse 17. If anyone has this world's good and sees a fellow believer in need but withholds compassion from him, how does God's love reside in him. Little children, let us not love in word or speech, but in action and truth. He's saying if anybody has what a brother needs in their hour of need, and we don't come along and we don't show compassion to them by giving to that need, how can we say God's love lives inside of us? Real compassion results in action, but it comes from the heart. And that's what Jesus is teaching us. Another righteous reason to be generous is it's a response to God's grace. Generosity is a response to God's grace. Have you ever stopped and just stepped back and thought about how gracious God has been to you? I mean, yes, certainly the most important way is the fact that he gave us Jesus Christ to be our sacrifice, to die in our place, to rise from the grave, to show us who we are and who he is, and so that we could become children of God through the death and resurrection of Jesus. Surely that is the greatest way that he has been gracious to us. But what about the fact that right now you're watching this on a computer or on a smart TV or on a cell phone or on a tablet? What about the physical graces God has given you and the fact that you live in the richest world the richest country in the world? What about the fact that you live in a place where the median poverty line is 30 times what it is in other nations? What about the fact that God has been gracious to give you a family or a church or a community? What about the fact that God's been gracious to give you good health? Have you ever stopped? I'm reminded of that old hymn, count your many blessings, name them one by one, count your many blessings, see what God has done. God has been generously gracious to us. And so when we are gracious and generous with others, we are simply responding to how God has acted with us. When we think about the incredible gift of God's grace, we are motivated to give generously. Ephesians 2:8, that great passage about salvation says this, "For you are saved by grace through faith. This is not from yourselves. It is God's gift." John 3:16, that verse that we grew up knowing learning says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son." It's only because of God's generosity that we are saved. So we should be generous to others because he was generous to us. So we should give a righteous reason for generosity is real compassion. It's a response to God's grace. But lastly, a third righteous reason, and there are more, but a third righteous reason I want to focus on today is when we are generous, we reflect God's glory. When we are generous, we reflect God's glory. Our righteous generosity results in thanksgiving to God. 2 Corinthians 9:11, Paul said, "You will be enriched in every way for all generosity, which produces thanksgiving to God through us." When we are generous with the right motives for the right reasons, people are thankful not just to us, but to God, because what we are doing is a reflection of who he is. Think of yourself as a mirror. Think of yourself as a mirror. And when we are generous with others, when we focus on others, when we are thinking about others, and when we are focusing on those things, what happens is we are a mirror that is reflecting who God is to the person that we are being generous of. And so we are simply reflecting generosity onto that other people. You may have heard people say, you might be the only Jesus that someone ever actually sees. Yes, you as a mirror might be a reflection of Jesus and his generosity to others. And then when people are thankful to you for what you've done, you simply reflect that back up to God and say, God gets all the glory. And so now you are reflecting the glory back to God. And in our generosity, we are reflecting God's glory to people because we are simply a mirror of who he is. I want to ask you this question. Does your life reflect the generosity of God? If people were hearing God is a generous God, and they looked at your life, would they not just hear it, would they see it? Would they see it in the way you interact with people? Would they see it in the way that you act with your money? Would they see it in the way that you treat others? How would they see generosity from God if you are the reflection of God that they see? Listen, here's the reality. We all fail in this way at some time or another. Some of us are better at being generous than others of us. We all struggle with this at certain times. And certainly there are times in our lives where we can't afford to be super generous because we're doing good just to make ends meet. But I want to give you 5 simple ways that you can express generosity today, okay? 5 simple ways, nothing fancy about these. These aren't straight out of Scripture, but this is just 5 simple ideas you could do. First, buy someone a meal. Buy someone a meal. Maybe it's a person in the car behind you when you go through Chick-fil-A tomorrow. Maybe it's the person who is at your work and they've been out with COVID, and so you decide to send them a meal via Shipt, or send them a pizza from Domino's, or send them something from Uber Eats or whatever. Just get a meal to them. Maybe that's one way, is just to buy a meal for someone. Second way is leave a big tip. And let me tell you, Christians, can I just be honest? I know a lot of people who have worked in the service industry, and they hate to work Sunday afternoons as waiters and waitresses. Do you know why that is? Because that's when they say the church crowd comes in, and they're the stingiest, penny pinchingest people who complain about everything. Please don't be that person. Don't be that person who refuses to give a good tip. Instead, be a generous person who gives a big tip. And if you want to say, well, I'm going to give a big tip, but how can I reflect that to God if they don't see it till it's gone? Then leave a little Bible verse there. Leave a note that says, I'm praying for you. Offer to pray for them, but then leave a big old tip. Don't offer to pray for them and then your bill's $35 and leave $1.50 change. Leave a big tip, because we want to reflect the incredible generosity of God to others, not just in the sense of giving a tip when you're at a meal. Maybe give a big tip to your Shipt shopper. Leave a present for the person who's been making all these Amazon Prime deliveries to you over the last 9 months. Be kind and generous to people, because God has been kind to us. A third simple way is, hey, buy some newborn diapers and newborn clothes and take them to the Piedmont Women's Center. There's one right here in Greer. It's near the Walmart, down across from where the Tipsy Taco, the old Bilo, the old Blockbuster, all that is. It's down on that end of town, and you can take newborn baby clothes and newborn diapers there, and they make gift packs for women who are about to have children. That's a simple way, something you can just grab a set of diapers while you're getting your groceries, even if you're just having them delivered to you. That's a simple way that you can be generous to someone. Fourth, give to a charity. You might say, well, Piedmont Women's Center isn't my charity, but I want to give to this charity. Look, be generous. Give to a charity. Give to a charity that's helping undernourished people find food. Give to a charity that's helping people who are struggling with medical bills. Find a charity and give to it, but do it generously for the purpose of bringing God glory. It's simple. And if you say, well, Chris, I want to give to a charity, but I don't know a charity, call me. Call the church office. We will direct you to a charity that you can work with, that you can give towards, that will help you be generous for the purpose of bringing God glory and doing good for people in the world. And then lastly, a fifth way you can be generous is by giving to the church. Your giving to the church is an act of generosity, because we take those gifts and we use them to take the gospel across the street and across the nations. And we help certain, we have certain charities that we come alongside and we help and we provide for. We do things like disaster relief. Many of you know about our disaster relief trailer, and you can give towards that so that when people are in deep need, we can come along and help with those disasters. The Southern Baptist Convention has an incredible disaster relief program, and we have an opportunity to help people who are in deep need after tornadoes or hurricanes or earthquakes or any number of natural disasters. We also support Greer Community Ministries, and so you can give through the church towards that as well, and that's a way that you can do, and many, many other things. Listen, here's the reality. The reality is it's a lot easier to be generous than we want to admit, because in our hearts, sometimes we get focused on making sure we have what we need instead of focusing on real compassion, focusing on reflecting God's glory and responding to God's generosity. That's the truth of the matter. That's the reality. But Jesus in our passage today calls us not to give like the hypocrites, not to make a big deal about it, but to be generous for the purpose of God's glory and others' good. Would you do that? Would you do that? I really hope you will, because this is one of the things that Jesus calls us to do as kingdom citizens. And if you are one of God's people, then you should be a generous person. As we close tonight, I want to ask you to continue to pray for our online campus. And maybe you're watching this and you're saying, well, I haven't connected with our online campus. Listen, it's super simple. Go to online.rbcgreer.com and you can just click the Join Now button and you can be a part of our online campus, our Facebook private closed group that will allow us to minister and grow in community together. Be praying for that campus. Be praying for Pastor Stephen as he leads that campus. We had a great launch on Sunday, and we're excited about what God has in store. Secondly, and this is a piece of information many of you have been wanting to know, what are our plans? When are we going to be able to get back together, those of us who want to gather together? Well, we have been watching the numbers very closely. And you should have gotten an email by this point, or you've probably seen it on social media. But our plan moving forward is this. Beginning this Sunday, February 7th, we will have only our worship service at 10 a.m. No Sunday school classes, and there will be no children's programming during the 10 a.m. service either. In person, we will have one service at 10 a.m. where we will be socially distanced, where masks are encouraged, and where we will have the opportunity to worship together in person. You might say, Chris, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that yet. That is fine. That is why we continue to have digital options for worship, and that is why you can continue to do that. You say, well, Chris, I don't know that I can bring my kids into the service. I don't know that they'll sit still. Listen, I don't mind a crying baby. I don't mind a rustling child as long as we're all worshiping God together. But if you feel that way, you say, I'm just not going to do it until we have children's ministry. We're still a couple of weeks out before we come back to children's ministry during our worship services and our Sunday school classes. Instead, for the next 2 weeks, February 7th and 14th, we will have our worship service at 10 a.m. in person and online, but there will be no other activities, excluding the fact that our youth, our tribe, our student ministry, they will meet on Wednesday nights at their normal time in person. We will continue to have our Wednesday night adult Bible study online only for the next 2 weeks as well, because we won't be offering children's ministry on Wednesday nights, and so we want to make sure that we are doing that correctly. So continue to join us, continue to walk alongside of us. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to call the church, email the church, send a message to our online campus or to someone connected to the church, and we will try to help you know exactly what's going on and how you can be a part. Listen, God is good, and we are His people. Let's go and make messengers of God's grace and be generous as we do. And have a great night.